Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going to be talking about the books that I've read this week. And it's been another fun one. Yeah, sort of slightly back on my international booker train. I'm very late with these. I think I kept on having this big intention. I was going to have read all of them by the shortlist being announced. It did not happen, but it's all fine. Such is life. So let's talk a little bit about the books that I did read this week instead. First up, I read Love Me Tender by Constance Debré. It's a translated book from French. And this is now where I sound incredibly pretentious because I don't know who the translator is because I read it in French. So I've probably missed a good number of the details here. But essentially, it is a story of a young woman whose child is basically pretty much taken away from her because of she has a fallout with her husband around the child and what that's all going to look like. And actually for her in the courts, it basically is this whole thing around, because she is a lesbian, or all of these sort of things around her sexuality, it's seen that she's an unfit mother and all of this kind of stuff. So there's this really interesting dynamic throughout the book of her feeling a sense of otherness, of sort of, she's not the right person to be this child's mother according to the courts, or at least according to these conversations with her ex. And therefore, when she does have these moments with her child, it's sort of these oddly precious moments where she's trying to really support the child, but also knows that this is a very fragile thing. And so much of this book is concerned with, sort of bits of anger around the situation, but also this really interesting thing around almost performing being the right kind of person. And so I found that really interesting throughout this book, the way that she talks about, how she can't look a certain way when she's in court, because that is, what might sort of count against her. So really, really interesting book. Next up, I read two books by the same author, well, sort of one and a bit. So I read first Taking Flight by Parikian, and he is a nature writer. Actually, he's from not particularly far away from me. He references a lot of places in his books that are very close to where I live, which is a bit daunting, but also lovely because I know what those places are. So he, in this book, Taking Flight, talks about the kind of wonder and amazement that is animals and insects and creatures being able to fly. So, for example, he talks about, everything from the common fly to, these birds like hummingbirds or what have you, who have very specific ways of flying and interacting with the world. And he talks about just the sheer wonder of spotting those birds and talking about them and thinking about them, and the kind of joy that can come from thinking about how miraculous it is that something like a bee can fly and go about its life, and that's just a fundamental part of what it does. He also looks at things like penguins who can no longer fly, and how there's this sort of interesting thing that they've still got these wings, they're still sort of, they look like creatures who could in theory fly. And it's really joyous. With the nature writing I've read before, it's always just really joyous when you see someone deeply, deeply passionate about what they're reading and talking about. And Lev is just sort of full of joy about just the wonder of the natural world around him, which also ties into the other book of his that I've been reading, which is Light Rains Sometimes Fall. And I've been wanting to read this before. He essentially takes the idea that a Japanese writer many years ago divided the year into 72 seasons. So instead of, the sort of the typical 4 that we think of, or even splitting it by month or anything like that, focused on the subtle individual changes that happen between parts of the year. So for example, the time where the weather very slightly shifts and a certain bird starts to appear again, or certain types of insects start appearing, or certain flowers start to bloom or to sort of hide away for the winter. And he talks about this again with such joy. And so the reason I say one and a bit is I'm still reading it now, but I'm basically planning on reading it bit by bit, because, there are dates given to it. So, for example, the one that I'm at the moment, I'm basically planning to get to where we currently are in the calendar year and then read it bit by bit. But, you know, for example, chapter 11, 26th to the 30th of March, moths sometimes fly. And I think what's beautiful is you've got just these sort of, he's taken these concepts of what this Japanese writer had spoken about and had sort of looked at it through his own lens and through a sort of British countryside and nature lens. I say countryside, he's not from the countryside, he doesn't live in the countryside, but how that interacts with the natural world. And there's a real joy to this. So I'm really looking forward to this being a slow book across the year that I read 4 or 5 pages of every couple of days or whatever, and I'm really excited for it. So yeah, that's that book. Next up, the book that's been on pretty much every list, I think, every prize list going recently, and that's I'm a Fan by Sheen Patel. And I listened to an interview with her recently, which I found really fascinating because I love the way she talks about this book, which is that this book is in some ways an anti-book. It has a story where she actually is quite comfortable with the idea of the reader being incredibly uncomfortable. She, at times, will directly challenge the reader to think a little bit about what they are perceiving with this. So she resists common narratives around, for example, women of colour, and particularly sort of underrepresented groups. So she, for example, has a whole section in a chapter about Shamima Begum, which was this sort of big controversial discussion in the UK around rights and citizenship and so many other things. She rebels against the idea of book prizes and awards, which is then really obviously wonderfully sort of, yeah, it's kind of funny given what's happened with this book, really, that this book has been nominated for so many prizes. And this is a book where she says, actually, you know, the whole idea of being shortlisted for a prize is kind of bunk. It's a weird thing of needing to be tapped on the shoulder by the literary establishment in order for your book to do well, but that's also the game. And so this book deals with all of those, and I'll probably do a separate video on it because I'm just fascinated by what this book has done. But I'm a Fan is largely concerned, after all of that preamble, is largely concerned with a woman at the heart of this book who goes, I believe, unnamed, and she has the man who she wants to be with is one of the other characters, and this other woman who he is with. And she basically spends her life watching these two people interact. So her interactions with this man and her interactions online through basically stalking or at least following the online activity of this other woman who he is having an affair with. And her obsession with both is so deeply unhealthy and so deeply troubling to us as the reader. But there's something so captivating about the way this is written, for me at least, of I was completely sold on this voice, this slightly neurotic, intense, I say slightly, this neurotic, intense voice all the way through the book, that is often making incredibly wise and clever points, but then at times is doing these things that are quite terrifying, you know, that kind of following all this online activity and not really looking after herself because she wants to be with this man, but also she doesn't really understand why she wants to be with this man, and she kind of hates him and she kind of hates this woman, but she kind of loves them both. And there's a real intensity to all of these relationships that's so uncomfortable. And I think it's brilliant. I think this book is so brilliantly done to capture the thoughts of that person in a way that for me was deeply believable and clever and made really intelligent points throughout. You know, this, I think, very easily could have been a very shouty book, a book that was just sort of always at 11, always talking about some of these big ideas. And I think what's really clever about it instead is that it is so subtle and it's so quiet at times, even though it doesn't always appear so. It's sort of slowly building a narrative throughout the book around the ludicrousness of the situation for so many people, and particularly marginalized people, particularly women of color. And so actually the fact that the main character is so divorced from reality is almost a commentary in itself. She's sort of she can't be part of this world with these two white people who have this sort of, you know, on the surface, these sort of perfect lives. And she understands that she can't fully access that world in a way that I think is fascinating. So anyway, I'm going to stop rambling because I probably will do a separate video because there's so much to talk about in this book. But yeah, I see what all the fuss is about. And last, but definitely not least, in my opinion, The Birthday Party by Laurent Mauvignier, and translated by Daniel Levin Becker. And I loved this. I was completely blown away by it, and I will be doing a separate video on it anyway. It was a book that I'd kind of already had an advance copy of and kept on meaning to read, and then just sort of didn't. And luckily the International Booker kind of nudged it up a little bit more and made me pay a little bit more attention to it. I think this is stunning. This is a gorgeous book. So the key idea behind this, essentially, is that this is a really tense book that deals with a series of characters who are due to be having a birthday party one day. That's the main kind of idea of where the plot is due to be going. However, there is essentially it's interrupted, and I don't want to give too many details away without spoiling it, because that's the thing, there's so much of that is at the heart of it. But essentially there is a major incident that stops this birthday party from happening, and what that then means is that all of these dark secrets about this family and this sort of group of people comes out in some capacity, and when people are pushed to their absolute limits, they reveal in some ways parts of their true selves, or even maybe their ugliest selves. And I think it's so fascinating what this book does. It seems like quite a long one at first. It's about 500 pages almost. But I think for me, it earned that length, because essentially this book is told in this really unwinding, unraveling kind of style. It's quite, not impenetrable, it's quite difficult at first because you do need to sort of get into the rhythm of it. And I will admit, the first time I tried reading this, I read a couple of pages and I was like, look, you know what, I think I'm too tired for this right now. I'm going to put it aside and come back to it in a couple of days. And I'm really glad I did, because when I restarted it, I was awake enough to be able to get into the rhythms of it. And I think this is a book that really demands your attention, and so it can be a really full experience. And some people haven't gotten on with that, and that's fine. I think for me, the nature of those long unwinding sentences was so powerful because it builds a rhythm for you. And given that this is a thriller, in many ways, it's sort of this literary thriller, it builds up into this speed that at times I think is just incredible. For me, this felt like the author was sort of sat, almost like Ratatouille, if you imagine the film, was sort of sat behind the terrible comparison point, but follow with me on this, was sort of sat behind, essentially manipulating where you were going to go next and how you were going to feel next. And he, in many ways, as an author, gives you the pace and the speed of this book. And obviously all books do that to some degree, right? But for those long sentences at times really draw you out into a state of tension where the length of the sentence is stopping you from knowing what happens next, and that is the crucial thing that makes you need to read on. At times it builds into a speed where you know that everything is happening, and so these long sentences are building pace. And I don't know how he's done this as a writer. I'm in awe of what has gone on here, and even more in awe in many ways of then the translator to then take that original and find a way of mapping that into another language and keeping that same tension and speed. And although there was a tiny bit, I think maybe where it lagged, maybe sort of 300 pages in briefly, I think overall the effect of this book is just so incredible at what it's been able to achieve, and I was completely blown away by this. So yeah, this is right up there in my favourites from the long list. So yeah, we shall see. But I mean, I think it's just already just such a fabulous book, and one that I'm going to be thinking about a lot in the time to come. That sounds very dramatic. From now on. But anyway, all of that aside, that book aside, I've been Bob the Booker, talking about my books this week. I hope you've had a wonderful week, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.